something that has never left me since. It wasn't in the Bible most people read every Sunday, but in a book that was once considered holy before the church locked it away, the Book of Enoch. It described the Watchers, angels who descended to earth and crossed boundaries they were never meant to. One name stood out above all others: Azazel. Unlike the others, his corruption went deeper, darker, almost as if he wanted to twist creation itself. According to 1 Enoch chapter 8, Azazel taught men how to forge weapons, to make war against one another, and to craft ornaments that led women into vanity. But what struck me most wasn't just his knowledge of metal or warfare. It was the hidden implication that he meddled with the very flesh of humanity. Some fragments translated from the Dead Sea Scrolls in the 1940s hinted at forbidden acts of creation, experiments that blurred the line between angel and beast. I found a note once in a commentary from the 13th century, written by a scribe in Toledo, Spain. It mentioned Azazel, the corrupter, who sought to make for himself a son not of heaven nor of earth, but of blood unending. That line haunted me. Was it just metaphor? Or had this scribe stumbled upon a tradition that others had tried to erase? Because if it were true, it meant that the very first vampire wasn't born of myth or folklore, but of a fallen angel's rebellion. You see, the Watchers were judged for taking human wives and producing the giants, the Nephilim. That story most of us know. But Azazel went further. His punishment, according to Enoch, was unique. He was bound hand and foot, cast into darkness, and covered with sharp rocks until the final judgment. Why such a severe sentence, harsher than many of the others? Some ancient rabbis believed it was because his sin was not just teaching or lust, but creating, making something that was never meant to exist. When I cross-referenced this with Mesopotamian tablets, I found stories of gods who created beings that drank the life of men. The Akkadian term was Ekimu, spirits of the restless dead, forever feeding but never satisfied. Could this have been a distorted memory of Azazel's forbidden offspring? It would explain why vampire-like legends appear across cultures long before Christianity or medieval Europe. Even the church fathers seemed uneasy about Azazel. Origen, in the 3rd century, wrote cautiously about the goat that is for Azazel in Leviticus 16, saying it was connected to a dark power exiled to the wilderness. Later, in the 4th century, Epiphanius accused some sects of secretly venerating Azazel as a giver of hidden knowledge. They must have known something that has since been buried, that this angel was more than a symbol of sin, but a being tied to something that walked the earth. When I pieced these fragments together, a chilling picture emerged. What if the myths of creatures that walk at night, feeding on blood, didn't begin in medieval castles or Gothic novels, but in the desert sands of ancient Canaan? What if Azazel's child still lingered, hidden in shadows, surviving floods and wars, whispered about in the margins of forgotten manuscripts? I know it sounds unbelievable, but I can't shake the feeling that the church silenced this story for a reason, that somewhere deep in their archives lies proof that the first vampire was not a human cursed, but Azazel's forbidden creation. And if that's true, then every legend of blood drinkers since is just an echo of that one, ancient sin. I remember the first time I read Leviticus 17:11, "For the life of the flesh is in the blood." It was supposed to be a simple command about sacrifice, but the words carried weight. Blood wasn't just a symbol, it was life itself. That's why the thought of Azazel corrupting blood felt so terrifying. If angels weren't meant to mix with humans, then taking blood and twisting it into something else was crossing the holiest boundary of all. The old rabbis wrote about this in whispers. In the Midrash Abkir, which only fragments remain. There's a passage that says Azazel taught the shedding of blood not for sacrifice, but for pleasure and for strength. Most scholars dismiss it as allegory, but I couldn't ignore the connection. Shedding blood for pleasure. Isn't that the very definition of vampirism? It wasn't just Jewish sources. In 2nd century Gnostic texts like the Apocryphon of John, I found veiled warnings about those who feed upon the power in the veins of mankind. They described entities who craved the essence of life itself, created by rebellious powers outside the will of the true God. To me, that sounded like another piece of the same story, carried across communities, but never openly admitted. The more I dug, the more I saw a disturbing pattern. Mesopotamian laments spoke of spirits who drink the blood of the living as punishment for sins. Early Coptic manuscripts warned against nocturnal beings that entered homes through shadows, draining families until they withered. None of these traditions ever called them vampires, but the imagery was identical, all of it tied back to blood being desecrated. There was one chilling record from the 9th century that still unsettles me. A Syrian monk wrote of a scroll kept in Antioch, claiming it held the testimony of a watcher's child. In it, the creature supposedly declared, "My father gave me blood, and I cannot die. My thirst is for the living, for the cup of man's heart." Whether real or not, the fact that this story was copied, preserved, and then buried told me someone believed it. Think about it. If Azazel really created such a being, it wouldn't just be a hybrid. It would be a mockery of God's order. Blood, meant to be sacred, was profaned, stolen, twisted, made into a source of survival for something unnatural. That's why these creatures weren't like the Nephilim giants who fell in battle. They didn't live by bread or meat. They lived by stealing the very essence of life. It makes sense now why early Christians were so strict about avoiding blood. The Council of Jerusalem in Acts 15 commanded Gentile converts to abstain from blood, and later the Apostolic Fathers repeated the warning. I always thought it was ritual purity, but now I wonder, were they trying to keep the church safe from something darker? Something tied to Azazel's sin? Everywhere I looked, the same conclusion stared back at me. The first vampire wasn't born cursed by chance. He was made deliberately. Azazel profaned blood to produce a creature that mocked the very breath of God, a being that would never hunger for bread or water, but only for the life flowing in veins. And if even one trace of that bloodline survived the ages, then the myths of vampires aren't fiction at all. They're fragments of truth we were never supposed to remember. The strangest part of the story wasn't just the thirst for blood, it was the body itself. Unlike the Nephilim, who were giants but still mortal, the creature of Azazel was said to resist death entirely. Some fragments of Enochic tradition describe it as a body that could be struck down, but not destroyed. That caught my attention, because it reminded me of something I once read in the Testament of Solomon, where spirits of the night claimed they could not be killed by sword or fire, only restrained for a time. In one Armenian manuscript from the 5th century, there's a marginal note beside the story of Noah. It says, "Not all perished in the flood, for one whose flesh did not decay walked among the mountains after the waters." Most historians dismiss it as myth, but what if that was a reference to Azazel's creation, a being whose flesh would not rot, even when the world itself was washed clean? There are stories from later centuries that line up disturbingly well. In the 11th century, a monk in Burgundy wrote of a man who had been buried 3 times, but each morning was found wandering outside his tomb. The villagers called him Revenant. The church called it superstition, but the description of a body that would not stay dead fit too closely with the older traditions to ignore. I once came across a fragment in Latin from the Vatican archives, quoted by a scholar in the 1700s. It spoke of the one who cannot perish, born of the desert exile. The note linked it to Azazel, calling the being a thorn that survives the fire. That phrase chilled me, because it implied the church knew of at least one case where this body that would not die had appeared again. Unlike humans who age and decay, the first vampire's body seemed locked in defiance of time. Some legends say its wounds sealed instantly, others that the skin turned pale and cold, unable to carry warmth, but never breaking apart. Imagine the terror of seeing a creature that bleeds but never weakens, a form trapped between death and life. That's not folklore, that's something engineered. And here's where it becomes even more disturbing. The early Kabbalists believed Azazel had stolen secrets from the Tree of Life before his fall. If that's true, then perhaps he twisted those secrets into a counterfeit immortality. Not eternal life as God intended, but an eternal prison. A body that continues but without soul, without peace, feeding endlessly to maintain itself. What scares me most is that this concept repeats across the world. The Chinese spoke of the Jiangshi, corpses that never decomposed. Hopping through villages at night, the Slavs feared the Upir, bodies that remained whole long after death. Even in Africa, there were tales of night walkers whose flesh could not be burned. Different names, same pattern, the body that would not die. When I put all of this together, I realized the truth. Azazel didn't just create a monster, he created a mockery of resurrection, a counterfeit of what God promised humanity through Christ. While Jesus rose to eternal life, this creature rose to eternal hunger. And perhaps that's why its story had to be erased, because its very existence was a shadow that mocked the hope of salvation. What disturbed me most after everything I had read was the realization that the curse was not simply on the body, but on the blood itself. The ancients always tied blood to life, but what Azazel had done twisted that truth into something grotesque. Instead of blood being the bridge between humanity and God, through sacrifice, through covenant, it became a prison. The creature's survival depended on draining others, turning what was sacred into theft. In the Book of Jubilees, which many early Christians read but the church later hid away, there's a passage that describes how demons sought to consume the blood of men and drink their life all the days of their existence. Scholars usually interpret this metaphorically, but when you consider Azazel's forbidden creation, it reads like a literal description. It was not a figure of speech, it was testimony. I once uncovered a commentary written in 1487 by a monk in Cologne, Germany. He connected the old Mosaic law, "You shall not eat blood," to the idea that something unholy had already corrupted it long ago. He warned that those who sought blood, even in ritual or sorcery, were imitating the son of Azazel, the thirsting one. That phrase stuck with me. The thirsting one. It sounded less like myth and more like a memory. The act of drinking blood was always considered the ultimate taboo. Even pagan nations that had no connection to Israel treated it with fear. Why? Because blood carried life force, and to steal it was to steal the essence of a person. This explains why the curse of Azazel's creation was endless hunger. No matter how much blood it consumed, it could never satisfy the void left by being cut off from the breath of God. There's an Ethiopian manuscript from the 12th century that adds a terrifying detail. It claims that the offspring of the Watchers had their souls burned away in judgment, but Azazel's creation was different. It had no soul from the beginning. That's why it needed blood, not to feed the body only, but to cling to existence, to fill a hollow that could never be filled. Think about that. The curse wasn't just physical thirst, it was spiritual emptiness. The creature could not create, could not grow, could not pass on life. It could only take. That explains why every culture that spoke of blood drinkers described them as sterile, barren, trapped in endless repetition. They were not alive, and they were not dead. They were caught in the curse of stolen blood. It makes sense then why the early church was so forceful on the Eucharist. To drink Christ's blood symbolically was life, but to drink human blood was damnation. The contrast was deliberate. The Eucharist pointed to divine restoration, but Azazel's creation pointed to corruption. 2 cups, 2 covenants, one of salvation, the other of curse. The more I pieced this together, the clearer it became. The vampire was not a coincidence of folklore. It was a theological wound, a reminder of what happens when the holy essence of life is profaned. The curse of blood is not only about thirst, it is about separation. Cut off from God, cut off from humanity, cursed to wander the earth with a hunger that proves you were never meant to exist. The flood is one of those stories we all think we know. Children's books paint it with smiling animals and a rainbow at the end, but the truth behind it was far darker.